I'm
that dog is barking. That is not my dog.
We will have started the recording just in time. So maybe we can start with a question from students. Would that be okay?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so I will invite Etty. Can you ask your question?
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Gabor Mate, for joining our class this session today. Really, honored to be in this class with you. I have a few questions, and please feel free to answer just some of it, one of it. I know we have limited time. So my question would be about situation in Gaza. As you mentioned in one of your past interview, children in Gaza are the most traumatized children in the world. So in your experience as a trauma-informed physician, how do you believe the concept of unchilding manifests in the context of the prolonged conflict in Gaza, and what are the long-term implications for the mental and physical well-being of the children affected? And you probably could elaborate more on that, and what are some effective approaches that can be implemented by educators and communities to address this deep psychological and emotional impact of the conflict on these children, and how can these approaches help in restoring their sense of safety, security, and childhood? Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you for the question. Let me just begin by saying that it's extraordinarily difficult to talk about the subject of what's happening in Palestine, in Israel. The whole history is so charged with trauma, and people's reactions to trauma, whether it's individual, personal, or collective trauma, multi-generational, well, not only multi-generational, but also collective, so determines their emotional responses to the situation that it's not even possible to agree on the facts, because people's capacity to receive and to process factual information is very much determined by their emotional stance. So you can have two perfectly well-meaning, good-hearted, intelligent individuals looking at the same situation, and because of their emotional orientation, they come to totally different conclusions. So this is true in general. But let's begin by saying that the Zionist project, which began about 120 years ago, no, I should say 140 years ago now, came out of tremendous trauma in Eastern Europe. And the Jewish trauma in Eastern Europe, I don't think I have to tell you about. It preceded the Holocaust. There was terrific anti-Semitism and killings of Jews, especially in Eastern Europe. And so the Zionist movement arose as a response to that suffering. And in theory, it's a rational response, because Jews are under threat everywhere. Let's create a state where they will not be under threat. The problem was that where they chose to create that state, due to all kinds of historical reasons, there was already a people living there. And there was no way to create a Jewish state without imposing a trauma on the indigenous population, the Palestinians. They knew that. They said that very clearly, that, this is a colonization process. The Zionist leader said, they used that word. And by the way, colonization comes from the Latin word colonus, for settler. So they knew that this was a colonization process that had to be imposed against the opposition will and interests of the indigenous population. I'm not going to go into the whole history. That would take another 3 hours. But essentially, that's what happened. So in order to create an escape and an antidote to that Jewish trauma, the there's a tremendous trauma that was imposed on the Palestinians, including the deliberate expulsion and massacres that have been documented by many Israeli historians. And it's not even disputable. I could quote them, but that's what happened in 1948, is that hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were deliberately expelled. 500 villages were destroyed. There were 24 massacres that, according to one Israeli historian, have been documented. And this is a historian who actually says that we had to do this. We had to expel these people, otherwise we couldn't have created our state. So he's not denying it. He just says we had to do it. Well, some of those expelled Palestinians then ended up in Gaza. So if you look at the current Gazan population, 70% of them are either direct survivors of that expulsion, very few of them at this point, because they'd be very old, or descendants. I'm not going to go into the whole history of what happened since then, except to say that the killings of large numbers of people in Gaza did not begin on October the 8th. It happened in 1953, it happened in 1956, and it happened over again repeatedly. And now, of course, it's happening on an unprecedented scale. That's not disputable. You might argue about, is it justifiable or not, but it is happening. In 2005, before the rise of Hamas to power, so we keep saying that this is all about Hamas. But you know what? Hamas didn't exist 40 years ago. There was no Hamas 40 years ago. One of the founders of Hamas saw his uncle being killed by Israeli troops back in 1956. He was 8 years old. And hundreds of Gazan men and boys were killed unarmed by the Israeli army. I'm not justifying Hamas. I'm just saying that just as the Jewish state was founded in Jewish trauma, the current Gazan situation is also informed by trauma. And in 2005, there was a study that appeared in the World Journal of Psychiatry. I mean, I could dig out the references that looked at war traumatized populations around the world, and the most traumatized children in 2005 were living in Gaza. This is a population that had lived in exile under terrible conditions, restricted to a small piece of land. And already in 2005, the most traumatized children in the world lived in Gaza. Now, that has a number of implications. One is that the fighters that streamed into Israel from Gaza on October the 7th, guess who they were? They were those children grown up, many of them. And whatever you think of what they did, and it was, nobody's arguing that wasn't an atrocity, but it's those traumatized kids grow up that committed those atrocities. I'm not giving that as an excuse. I'm just saying that's the history. Now, that was in 2005, before multiple Israeli bombings of Gaza and before the rise of Hamas. Since then, there's been 4 or 5 campaigns when Israel has bombed Gaza, killing hundreds of children and hundreds of civilians. Nothing new about that at all. The scale is new, but the action is not. So if in 2005, the world's most traumatized children lived in Gaza, what do we suppose is the situation now? When every day, 10 Palestinian children lose one or both legs. When every day they're killed, when there's 30,000, I'm not sure, 18,000, 20,000, 30,000 orphans in Gaza. Orphans. When I visited the occupied territories, I've done that. I've been to Gaza, but that was a long time ago. But last year I was in the West Bank, working with Palestinian women tortured in Israeli jails. By the way, let me remind you of something. When there was this exchange of prisoners and hostages recently, out of the 240 Palestinian prisoners released, most of them were between the ages of 14 and 17. Children. So when I was there, I was told by one Palestinian healer that there's no post-traumatic stress disorder here because the trauma is never post. Now that's being magnified exponentially by the present horrors. And already international organizations and Palestinian organizations are thinking of what are we going to do here after this is over. And I've been asked to participate in some planning. At this point, you know what? To be honest, I'm rather stumped because I have no idea how we can respond to such devastation. And again, whatever you think of the political reasons behind it, on a human level, it's devastation. And people are going to be scared, they're going to be traumatized. I read recently that in Israel, of the soldiers that have gone into Gaza recently, 1,600 have already PTSD. These are the Israeli soldiers. Now, can you imagine what the impact is on Palestinian children? It's going to take a lot of time, a lot of resources, a lot of patience, a lot of creativity. The essence of trauma is the loss of a sense of safety in the world. Well, that lot, and we talk about PTSD as a disorder. It's not a disorder. It's a totally normal response to abnormal circumstances. If people after a horrific experience come out of it with a lack of trust, of safety in the world, that's a normal response to an abnormal situation. That's the whole point of my whole book that was so kindly mentioned, the myth of normal, is I'm saying that what we consider to be mental health conditions are very often normal response to abnormal circumstances. So I'm going to bring this to a close. I don't have a good answer for you, but it's going to take a lot of effort, and it's going to take a lot of caring people going in there and trying to create a sense of safety and connection with these children so that the lost trust, the loss of trust that they have developed in the world can slowly somehow be restored. I can't say more about that right now.
Thank you so much. We truly appreciate very thoughtful and kind answer. I would like to ask another student in this class, Heidi, can you ask your question?
Sure. Thank you so much.
And also, please introduce yourself.
Oh, okay, gotcha. Thank you so much, Dr. Mate. My name is Heidi. I'm a student here at Harvard GSE. My question is, what do you think, or what aspect of human nature do you see contributes the most to what you call a toxic culture or toxic society? And how can we humans acknowledge that and prevent that from showing through in the future?
You're asking me about human nature, are you?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, the thing with human nature is that there isn't one. Not in the sense of programmed behaviors and reactions. What there is tremendous human potential. And we're born with human needs. Now, in this society, in this capitalist society, which is a competitive, aggressive, individualistic economic ethic, we have a sense of human nature. So when somebody does something selfish and manipulative and greedy, we say, oh, that's just human nature. But that's an assumption. As Noam Chomsky points out, every society has some explicit or implicit concept of human nature that mirrors its own values. So the values of this society, which is individualistic, aggressive, and competitive, selfish, we think that's what human nature is. It's very interesting because when you do something generous or giving or heart opened or loving, nobody says, oh, that's just human nature. But actually it is. Because if human needs are met, then our potential for collaborative, communal, loving, heart-opened interactions is actually supported. But if human needs are frustrated, then they're not. So when you look at how we evolved as human beings, we did not evolve under conditions of what we call civilization. We evolved in small band hunter-gatherer groups, where groups of 80 to 100 people would live together, migrate together, work together, raise their children together. Kids grew up in the context of safe relationship with multiple adults. There was a sense of belonging. And if you look at indigenous populations, wealth or success wasn't necessarily defined by how much you owned, but by how much you gave. That was true, for example, here in British Columbia. So completely different sense of human nature. Now, if the existence of our particular species, Homo sapiens, can be expressed on the face of a watch like as 1 hour, then until 6 minutes ago, we lived in small band hunter-gatherer groups. And what we call civilization, with its wealth accumulation and competition and inequalities, is 6 minutes. So there are certain human needs that we're actually born with, just as any animal is born with certain needs, certain expectations. Even the word expectation, we have to watch it, because it's not that the human child is born with expectations. The child doesn't have any conscious expectation. The child is an expectation. Like our lungs don't expect oxygen. They are an expectation for oxygen. They would not exist if there was no oxygen in the Earth's environment. So the lungs are an expectation for oxygen. Denied that expectation, we can't live. In the same way, the human child is an expectation for being loved and accepted unconditionally and supported and protected. An expectation to be able to experience all our emotions and to be able to express them and to have that validated and understood and supported by the parenting environment. We're an expectation for free, spontaneous play out in nature, and so on. When those expectations are met, we become communal, individuated, self-respecting members of a community. And we see each other and ourselves as that way. When those needs are denied, then we have to struggle to make it against other people who are struggling to make it against us. So that's how we perceive it. Now you have a totally different concept of human nature. So what I'm saying is, and there's a lot of talk about genetics. Well, the great American neurobiologist Robert Sapolsky says that basically we're genetically determined not to be determined by our genes. So our genes open up all kinds of potentials, but what is realized and what is not realized, what is fulfilled and what is not, depends very much on how the environment acts on those genes. So to summarize, human nature is basically totipotential. Buddha was a human being. Jesus was a human being. Hitler was a human being. It all depends on conditions. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Much appreciated. And we have, if I am, I know there are some questions on the chat window as well as Sadi, you have your hands up. I would ask another student from this class to ask a question, and then probably we'll switch to those in the Zoom. So, Ludan, can you speak it louder? Also, introduce yourself.
Okay, so hi, Dr. Gabor Mate. I'm Ludan Liang from this class and very appreciate for coming. And here's my question. I agree with what you said that we can learn to take responsibility for the mind with which we create our world, so that we cannot change the external environment, or change others, we can only change ourselves. So because the trauma exists for a long time maybe, and may accompany a person's growth and growth process, he or she may be very cautious or even resistant to facing the trauma and to feeling the trauma. So this is my question. How do you determine when is a person has recovered from the trauma, or if he or she can effectively avoid recalling the trauma? Is that calling that he or she overcome it? That's my question. Thank you.
So I just want to make sure I understand you. Your question is, how do you help or guide somebody to deal with the trauma if they don't want to? Is that basically the question?
Yes, and I want to know how to determine that if he or she has already overcome the trauma. If she can just avoid to, yes.
Well, basically, whether or not, I think the original quote was, I think you were quoting me, where I said that we may not be responsible for the world that created our minds, but we can be responsible for the world that we create that our minds create, you know? And this goes back to something that the Buddha said 2,500, 2,600 years ago. And he said that in the first statement in his collection of sayings, the Dhammapada, Buddha said that everything is the mind in the lead. So that whatever our mind perceives, that's how we're going to see the world. And we can see that playing out today. I mean, there's so many divisions and so much hostility. People are looking at supposedly the same world, but they see totally different realities because they're programmed to see different realities. Now, what creates the mind? What creates the brain? Well, I'll tell you a little secret from Harvard University. There was when I say little secret, by the way, let me tell you about Harvard University, okay?
Please.
In 1939, at Harvard, there was a very well-known and highly respected physician. His name was Soma Weiss, W-E-I-S-S, Dr. Soma Weiss. To this day, at Harvard, there is a day in his honor. There's a Soma Weiss Research Day at Harvard every year. And in 1939, Soma Weiss gave a lecture to the medical school class at Harvard. And he said that social and psychic factors play a role in every disease, but in many conditions, they represent dominant influences. And he said that mental factors present as active a force in the treatment of patients as chemical and physical agents. He said this in 1939. This lecture was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 1940. He was talking about that mind and body can't be separated, and that people can't be separated from their social circumstances. 1939, 1940. To this day, they have a day in his honor. And 5 years ago, when I was writing this book, I was interviewing a psychiatrist friend of mine at Harvard, and he said that to talk about mind-body unity at Harvard is still to jeopardize your career. Now put that in your pipe and smoke it. So to go back to Harvard in 2012, there was an article published from the Harvard Center on the Developing Child, the world's most prestigious child developmental study organization. The article appeared in the Journal of Pediatrics, which is the official journal of the American Pediatric Academy. And it said basically that the brain develops an interaction with the environment, and that the most important influence on the development of the brain is the emotional relationship with the nurturing adults. So that the brain itself is a social product, and it's a manifestation of people's emotional experience, which means that the mind is the same. So that the kind of minds that we have is very much determined by the kind of world that we're born into and how we're treated and what happens to us. So that's what I meant, that we may not be responsible for the world that creates our minds. Now, the question of healing then is to become conscious and aware and to undo all that programming. Now, how do we know when that programming has been undone? When the past no longer determines our present. When I see something happening in the present, I'm just seeing what's happening right now. But my reaction to it is not conditioned by the past. And this is true in personal relationships and also in politics. Not that we don't know the past, not that we don't take the past into consideration, but we don't automatically react as if the present was the past. So that the example I gave in my book is that when my wife doesn't pick me up from the airport after a speaking trip, I don't react like a baby who's been abandoned by his mother, which I was. I'm not going to go into the story. But the point is, when I react from that emotional stance of the abandoned baby, I'm not healed. So how do you know if somebody's healed their trauma? When they're present and in connection. And the other aspect of trauma, or the major one, is disconnection from our emotions. So when I'm in the present and I know what I feel and I can distinguish between present and past, then I've healed a trauma. And as long as I'm reacting, I heard somebody say the other day that, the Buddhist word for suffering is dukkha, the Pali word dukkha. Well, dukkha not only means suffering, it also means reactivity. So when something happens, whether on a political or an individual level, and I'm reacting as if the past was happening right now, I haven't healed my trauma yet. Now, to come back to your question about how do you get somebody to do it, you cannot. There's the expression, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. You can't even lead the horse to water. What you can do is open up the possibility that they may wish to examine things for themselves. But you cannot do that forcefully. As the spiritual teacher said, only when compassion is present will people allow themselves to see the truth. So if you're working with somebody who's clearly still in a traumatized state because they're reacting rather than responding, they're not in the present. And if they're not open to examining it, trying to force them is actually aggressive. Don't. Be compassionate. Be curious about them. And perhaps in the presence of that safety and compassion, something will open up in them that'll help them gain the courage and the curiosity to look at themselves from a different point of view. So what I'm saying, just to sum it up, you can create the conditions in which they might open up, and that condition has to be safety and compassion. Beyond that, you can't force it. But I find in my work that if I can provide that safety, that connection, that sense of acceptance, non-judgment, People are very open, very often. Not always.
Thank you so much. I feel that we are learning here so much from your wise words. The book, the story that Dr. Gabor Mate did not go into details, it is in this book. So you get a copy and read more about this story. I would like to call on, yeah, sure. Okay, so please introduce yourself and speak loudly.
My name is Kanza. I go to Harvard Graduate School of Education. Thank you so much, Dr. Gabor, for giving us your time. In class, we were talking about dehumanizing narratives and how harmful dominant narratives have material consequences. So I want to talk about like the flip side of how there's a narrative building now. It is not yet dominant, but it's building amongst like non-white communities and countries. In my personal experience as well, about Americans and Israelis, like not just like the American government, but like the complicity of regular American people, how like their taxes are funding a genocide. And like the consistent sort of like vetoing of a ceasefire in the United Nations. And this narrative is, derived from like a lot of hurt and anger that the international community is feeling about like the complicity and like Americans or like the American government not doing enough to stop this genocide. So how do you like respond to a narrative that is now starting to build from that anger and hurt? Like in my personal experience too, like going to Harvard, like we're all about like equity, justice, and speaking for the marginalized or giving voice to the marginalized. But when it comes to actually talking about people that are oppressed, like in the present, there's a lot of, at best, there's silence, at worst, there's like defense and like support for that. We have a tenured professor at the Harvard Kennedy School who tweeted for the collective punishment of Palestinians, and you still see students coming to his defense or like supporting his words. Like how would you react and respond to that?
Well, so yeah. Many of you probably know that I'm speaking as a Jew and a former Zionist. And that was accompanied by a certain set of beliefs about the other, about the enemy. Now, dehumanization of the marginalized is a very common phenomenon in our society. When I was working with a highly drug-addicted population here in Vancouver, and I wrote my book, In the Realm of Hunger Ghosts, about what addiction is really all about, which is not about choices or drugs, it's about trauma and people's desperate attempts to escape from trauma. I was often praised for humanizing the addicts. And I thought, what a weird thing to say. You mean they were not human to start with?
Exactly.
But there is this process of dehumanizing, which is to say, what does it mean to dehumanize? Is to see them as lacking subjective experience that we have to be concerned with. Now, that's very common in colonial societies. So in North America, as we know, both Canada and the US were founded on the extirpation of the local populations. So they had to be dehumanized. Otherwise, how do we justify what we do to them? Australia, the same thing. Any imperialism or colonialism is based on, or at least is accompanied necessarily by dehumanization. Our minds have still not been decolonized. So let me tell you, in Canada, until a few decades ago, it would not be unusual for an Indigenous kid to go to a state or church enforced residential school, have them speak their native tongue in the class, and the punishment was to have a pin stuck in their tongue. That'll teach them not to use their native language. I could go on about the tortures inflicted on indigenous kids in this country for 100 years, until very recently. 3 years ago, there was a poll in Canada. 70% of Canadians said they knew nothing or little about the residential schools. If you did a poll in the United States, how did the Americans grow up? They grew up watching John Wayne killing Indians. Indians being the bad guys. If you went to school in the United States, you might learn about the fact of slavery. You'll hear very little about the actual nitty-gritty subjective experience of slavery. So in colonial cultures and in colonizing cultures, I mean, I don't know if you knew this, but the Dutch, the great nation of Rembrandt and other great artists, did you know, raise your hand if you knew this, that after the Second World War, the Dutch killed 250,000 Indonesians? Raise your hand if you knew that. One person. Raise it, 2 hands. Okay, 3. Raise your hand if you knew that in the 1990s, 100,000 Guatemalans were massacred by the military with their army trained by the US and Israel. Raise your hand if you knew that. Okay. Why don't we know these things? I could go on. Because the colonial mentality does not consider important the experience of the marginalized. So then the Israel-Palestine conflict again feeds into that same situation. So the American mind is much more programmed to identify with the European colonizer than with the indigenous population. Not only that, you've been told a narrative for 70 years now that just does not represent or present the narrative of the other. You've heard one narrative. I'm talking about Americans now. You read the New York Times, but let me tell you what I think of the New York Times. The New York Times, I would say, is just because you read it in the New York Times doesn't necessarily mean that it's not true. If you look at America's wars, Vietnam War, when Martin Luther King criticized the Vietnam War, you know what the New York Times said? They said, now he's crossed over a line. It has enthusiastically endorsed every one of America's military adventures. The weapons of mass destruction, you heard about them, that they didn't exist. 500,000 Iraqi people died because of that lie, which the media trumpeted enthusiastically, without question. Well, that same media trumpets a certain point of view of the Middle East conflict, which again represents a colonial mindset. So it's a very difficult task, and you have to recognize, I think what, in a nutshell, my answer is you have to decolonize your own minds. It means you have to really question everything, really question everything. Now, the New York Times said the article 2 days ago that said 9 Israeli soldiers died underlying the cost of war. It didn't say 400 Palestinians died underlying the cost of war. It said 9 Israeli soldiers died. But whose point of view was the New York Times taking there? Or a few weeks ago, there was a headline, settler violence threatens stability in the West Bank. What's their idea of stability? Horrific oppression. But maybe the settlers are going a bit too far now. So you've got to decolonize your mind, which means really question everything, investigate everything, and to keep doing that. And from that position, you can't change somebody else's mind, but you also mustn't let yourself be intimidated. Now, in a couple of weeks, I'm having a debate online with the Dr. Rabbi David Wolpe, who was still a visiting scholar of divinity at Harvard. And he's one of these Jewish leaders who completely believes in and echoes and mirrors the mainstream colonizing narrative. And he resigned from the Harvard Committee on Anti-Semitism because there's so much anti-Semitism at Harvard. What are they calling anti-Semitism? Presenting the Palestinian point of view. Don't fall for that lie. A lot of Jews reject that perspective. There's nothing anti-Semitic. Don't be intimidated. Don't let them colonize your mind. Now, that doesn't make you necessarily right. So when you make your criticism, if you have one, of the mainstream narrative, make sure you're grounded in reality, you know your facts. But the fact that you're questioning the mainstream narrative and that you're questioning the Israeli official narrative, that does not make you an anti-Semite. Don't let them tell you that it does. Don't let them put that shackle on you, that ideological shackle on you. There are Israelis who are saying the same thing. It's just that they don't get voices in North America. There's even an Israeli lawmaker, Jewish, who signed the petition to the International Court on Genocide. Now, that's one Israeli lawmaker out of 150. He does not represent any, he's an outlier, but he's Jewish and he's Israeli. So don't let them tell you that it's anti-Semitism. That's my answer.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We have many waiting patiently in the online. So I would like to give the floor to Sadi, who was a student, former student of this class, and an alum. Sadi, please unmute yourself and ask.
Hi, I'm Sadie. I grew up in the United States, and that being said, definitely still have criticism of the US. I work in education as a teacher, as faculty from K-12 education and teaching kids to investigate history, to teaching classes at Harvard. And a lot of my work is in building psychologically safe holding environments where teachers can move through work and feel supported so that there's a really authentic trickle down of building classrooms where students can flourish. And I had made announcements in classes in October that us in education are in the work towards flourishing and against suffering for all peoples, in whatever that means and however people identify. And I wholeheartedly believe that that is a part of our work. I don't want this question or this call from my perspective to stay dwelling in, Jewish history since 1,000 years before Common Era or other things as opposed to the last 160 years. What I would like to take a moment to ask is that I noticed that a lot of people are sort of engaging in this competition of who's the most traumatized, or mainstream media. We're seeing anything from Syrian refugees to Israel-Palestine to down the street in New York or Massachusetts, and some things make mass media and some don't. But I noticed that you had made a comment in the beginning of this conversation, about 30, 40 minutes ago, XYZ group, the most traumatized. And I'm a bit curious about this rhetoric because I'm hearing people, I'm more oppressed, and sort of these battles playing out across the world stage. And I'm wondering how you see engaging in conversations where we can invite people in without sort of hierarchically talking about who's more oppressed, because I don't think that's serving the flourishing of anyone.
Can I ask you a question? How are you feeling right now?
Physically, a level of heat.
Okay. And what's the emotion?
Worry and defensiveness.
So there's some fear there for you.
Yeah.
What are you afraid of?
Um,
By the way, I get into those states too, so I'm not
Yeah.
criticizing you. I just want to communicate with you. That's all. Okay.
yeah,
What
absolutely.
what is your fear? What is your fear right now?
I think my fear is that I've committed my life to work in building global citizens and critical thinkers and loving children who grow into loving adults, or loving adults that can support loving children. And the world feels really disheartening.
It's hard work, isn't it?
A level of hopelessness sometimes is tough to combat.
I got it. Okay. And what is your fear at this moment? Because you're talking to me.
I guess my fear is that this call is only a microcosm of the microphone that has been given to you over the course of a very meaningful and very successful career. And the fear is that I heard you say X, Y, and Z group is the most traumatized. And
Okay,
to me,
okay, so first of all, allow me to interrupt you, okay?
yes, absolutely.
You heard me say nothing of the sort.
Okay.
That was your interpretation. I quoted a study, a psychiatric study, that looked at the percentage of children traumatized around the world in war situations. And they found the highest percentage in Gaza. That's all I said.
Okay.
I did not compare anybody's suffering to anybody else's suffering. I don't do that. Because like you, I don't believe in it. I simply gave you a statistic. And in that study, 98% of young people and children in trauma were traumatized. Okay. That was not a dismissal. Now, what's interesting to me is that you heard what I didn't say, and you didn't hear what I did say, which I suggest comes from a trauma response on your part. Because clearly you're a good-hearted, intelligent, committed, idealistic person. Okay. So the fact that you heard what I said, it's an understandable mistake, but it's a mistake. I was just giving you a fact. I didn't make up that fact. Okay. And I don't compare levels of suffering. I was just giving you anyway. So that's the first point. So I invite you to examine the mind with which you hear me. When you say, I've been given a microphone, nobody's given me a microphone. I've just done a certain amount of work that a lot of people respect. And believe me, I've lost a lot of followers over my speaking out about this issue. And the decision that I've had to make was, what's more important to me? And I talk about this in the book. What's more important to me? Authenticity or attachment? Attachment means how people accept me or like me, or being true to myself. I made the decision a long time ago that authenticity is more important to me. My whole work is based on it. So I've lost a lot of people. They hate me now, or they disappointed. I broke their hearts. Maybe you're one of them. I don't know. Okay. Now to go back to your last point about hopelessness, I'm not hopeless. I don't even believe in hope. Hope is something will happen in the future. I don't walk around with hope. I walk around with possibility. The question I ask is, what is possible? And that's in the present moment. Now, let me tell you about some spectacular failures in human history, okay? Buddha, total failure. Love, compassion, wisdom, mindfulness. How's that going in the world today? The Jewish prophets, justice, putting truth above state and nationality and government. How's that going? Jesus, love, forgiveness. How's that going? From one point of view. From another point of view, where would this world be without those voices? And you probably know this statement by I think it was Rabbi Hillel, I'm not sure anymore. 100 years before Jesus, he says, the task is not yours to finish, but neither are you free not to take part in it. And if not now, when? You don't have to have hope. You just have to have a commitment, which you already have. And you're going to contribute in your own way to that whole process of what is called in Hebrew, tikkun olam, healing the world. Why should you be hopeless about that? You're going to keep doing that. And you know what? You're going to work 24/7, 7 days a week. And when you die, you will be a total failure. Or will you? So that's what I would say to you. Okay?
Thank you so much for being so authentic, honest, and kind. I am mindful of time. May I invite one question?
Yes, just one. And then I have I'd love to stay with you, but I just have to go. So yeah, one more question. Sure.
Yes. So there were many questions. Anushka submitted the question a while ago. So I would invite Anushka, if you can unmute and ask the question. My apologies to others, but please share your question in the chat window and I will pass it on to Dr. Gabor Mate.
Thank you so much for this amazing opportunity. I have personally benefited from your work, Dr. Gabor Mate. I'm Sri Lankan, but I live in England. I am also an alum of the Harvard School of Education, and thank you to Maung for extending the invitation to me. We're doing some work in Sri Lanka with some very disadvantaged youth. I was wondering, if you had any strategies or if you can even point me to any research studies on helping these students who are, really traumatized to be conscious and aware of their own trauma and to help them heal themselves because of the poverty they're in. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you for the question. I want you to notice your language, how you speak about these things. Disadvantaged. What the heck does that mean? It's a euphemism for oppressed or marginalized or poor. Even the way we talk is so sanitary, disadvantaged, I think is a euphemism. But I know who you're talking about. Okay, look, just for lack of time, all I can tell you is what these kids grew up with is a complete lack of safety and lack of safe connection to adults. If you want them to learn emotional intelligence or critical thinking, any of that, the basis of it has to be emotional safety. When people feel emotionally safe, unless they feel emotionally safe, their organism is in defensive mode, which is flight or fight or freeze. In the defensive mode, there's no learning, there's no development, there's no growth, there's just defense. For reasons not of their own fault, very often these kids, and Sri Lanka is another country that, as you know, has had a very traumatic history in the last few decades. And the troubles are far from over. So what you need to provide them is a sense of safety so that they're not in defensive mode. When they're not in defensive mode, the parts of the brain, the midfrontal cortex, that can allow critical thinking and rationality and insight and social connection with others, it can open up and develop. So really what you're talking about is how do we promote healthy brain development through compassion, love, and safety, not by teaching skills. Teaching the skills is good, but it's secondary to opening their minds to the possibility of learning. Well, thank you for the question, and that's where I have to jump off the ship. I thank all of you for your attention.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much. We feel immensely blessed and very fortunate to learn from your wisdom. Thank you so much again, and have a wonderful day. And we will be forever grateful for our words. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Maung.
Love to all.
Okay, so please share your question.
It was just after dawn in Woody Creek, Colorado, when the first plane hit the World Trade Center in New York City on Tuesday morning. And as usual, I was writing about sports, but not for long. Football suddenly seemed irrelevant compared to the scenes of destruction and utter devastation coming out of New York on TV. The towers are gone now, reduced to bloody rubble, along with all hopes for peace in our time, in the United States or any other country. Make no mistake about it, we are at war now.
There must be some way out of here. Send the Joker to the league.
It will be a religious war, a sort of Christian jihad, fueled by religious hatred and led by merciless fanatics on both sides. Guerrilla warfare on a global scale with no front lines and no identifiable enemy. We're gonna punish somebody for this attack, but just who or what will be blown to smithereens is hard to say. Maybe Afghanistan, maybe Pakistan, or Iraq. This is going to be a very expensive war, and victory is not guaranteed for anyone, and certainly not for anyone as baffled as George W. Bush. He will declare a national security emergency and clamp down hard on everybody, no matter where they live or why. Winston Churchill once said the first casualty of war is always the truth. The lid is on. Loose lips sink ships. Don't say anything that might give aid to the enemy.